Hello, this is Dr. Morris. I'm doing a review for the Anatomy and Physiology class, Anatomy and Physiology 2. This is the nervous system and the endocrine system review for both the lecture and the lab portion, exam number 4. I'll start with the lab portion of the review. If you've done the course document in files under the Anatomy and Physiology lab, you notice that I've placed illustrations and photographs of the endocrine system related specifically to the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. You should appreciate the relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. You should be able to identify the location of the hypothalamus gland. You should be able to identify the location of the mammillary body, which sits inferior to the hypothalamus. Also the location of the optic chiasm, which also sits inferior to the hypothalamus. Should be able to identify the structure known as the infundibulum. This is a connection between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. You should be able to clearly identify the anterior and posterior lobes of the pituitary gland. You should be able to identify the portions of the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, which include the pars tuberalis, the pars distalis, and the pars intermediate. This is an illustration that demonstrates the thyroid gland, another one of the endocrine organs. Should be able to identify its location in the anterior portion of the neck. As you can see, it lies inferior to the thyroid cartilage of the larynx. Should be able to identify the portions of it, the left lobe and the right lobe, the center, which is referred to as the isthmus of the thyroid gland, and its circulatory vessels, the superior thyroid artery. Another endocrine structure is the adrenal gland. Should be able to identify its position. It sits superior to the upper pole of the kidney. Oops, sorry. The gland is also broken into two parts. One, the cortex, or the outer covering of the adrenal gland, and the inner surface, the medulla. The adrenal cortex itself is divided into 3 portions, which you should be able to identify: the zona reticularis, the zona fasciculata, and the zona glomerulosa. Some other gross anatomical structures which will be included on this lab. We'll go ahead and start with the nervous system, starting with the brain. This is a gross anatomical view of the brain. You should be able to identify the frontal lobe, should be able to identify the temporal lobe, you should be able to identify the occipital lobe, and you should be able to identify the parietal lobe. You should also be able to identify the cerebellum, should be able to identify the medulla oblongata, should be able to identify the location of the pons. Those are major structures that you should be able to identify on the brain. This is a illustration of the spinal cord as it passes through the vertebrae. Always identify your view. This is a posterior view of the spinal segment, looking at a spinous process, and the transverse process is here. You see the nerve roots as they come directly off the spinal cord. These are spinal nerves that we're looking at here. You should be able to identify the meningeal covering. Now remember, these meningeal coverings extend up all the way around the brain and extend down through the spinal cord, but you should be able to identify the pia mater, easily identified because it is the layer that adheres most closely to the nervous tissue itself. Also, blood vessels will course through the pia mater, and you can see that clearly on the illustration here. There is a space between the pia mater and the next level, which is called the arachnoid mater. The space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater is referred to as the subarachnoid space. So you should be able to identify the arachnoid covering. And then the outermost covering is referred to as the dura mater. And there is a space between the dura mater and the arachnoid mater. It cannot really be appreciated on this illustration, but that space is called the subdural space. So 3 layers you should be able to identify: the pia mater, the arachnoid mater, and the dura mater. Should be able to identify these as spinal nerves because they are coming off at the point of the spinal vertebrae. Remember, there are 2 types of nerves: spinal nerves, and then there are the cranial nerves. The cranial nerves come directly off the brain and don't actually enter into the spinal column. This is a gross anatomical view, and then also you have what's referred to as a myelogram. This is a diagnostic study that helps you to identify the tail of the spinal cord, and the tail of the spinal cord is referred to as the cauda equina. You should know that. The terminal portion, also the filum terminale, you should know that as well. This is another gross anatomical view that just demonstrates nerves, particularly spinal nerves, as they come off the cord. You're looking at spinal blood vessels. You're looking at, again, the most intimate covering that lies directly next to the spinal or to the nervous tissue is the pia mater. You see the blood vessels that course through here. This is an anterior view. You see each of the nerve roots as they come off. You should be able to identify the plexus, and there are some key nerves that I want you to be able to identify in the plexus. You should be able to identify the cervical plexus. As you notice, it surrounds and is intimately involved with the cervical vertebrae, the first key. You should be able to identify the phrenic nerve, You see the phrenic nerve here coursing along laterally here along the cervical vertebrae, so you should be able to identify the phrenic nerve. You should know what primary structure is innervated by the phrenic nerve. C3, 4, and 5, phrenic nerve. You should be able to identify this plexus, this nerve plexus. Again, you see it extends from the cervical vertebrae in the very first thoracic vertebrae. This is called the brachial plexus. It extends under the subclavian, under the clavicle, and extends down the arm. There are 3 key nerves here that I want you to be able to identify. You should be able to identify the median nerve. You see the median nerve courses all the way down, passes under the flexor retinaculum. You don't see the flexor retinaculum here now, but if you remember back to the muscle system, the flexor retinaculum crosses here. There's also a nerve that's going to course laterally. Remember, in the anatomical position, the palms face out. So laterally, that's going to go along the thumb side, or it will go over or course over the radius bone, and this is referred to as the radial nerve. The radial nerve. It extends down, it branches into a superficial radial nerve and a deep radial nerve. But if you know that as a radial nerve, that's all I'm asking you to be able to identify, radial nerve. And then on the medial aspect, and remember the medial aspect is going to be along the 5th digit or the little finger side. And remember that means it courses over the ulna bone. And if you recall, again from A&P 1, the ulnar nerve actually passes posterior to the medial condyle of the humerus, and it passes posterior to the olecranon process of the ulnar bone before it takes an anterior course, and by the time it reaches the wrist area or the carpal bones, it's in an anterior position. And so that is the ulnar nerve, You can see it coursing here in the upper arm, running posterior and then extending anteriorly. This is an up-close view of the brachial plexus. You should be able to identify the nerve, should be able to identify, sorry, it's moving faster here, should be able to identify the plexus referred to as the sacral plexus. The sacral plexus. You can get two views, an anterior view and a posterior view of the sacral plexus. The key nerve that I want you to be able to identify that comes off this plexus is the sciatic nerve. The sciatic nerve. This is the sciatic nerve as it courses here posteriorly. Large nerve, actually you'll be giving injections, those of you who are going to go into clinical practice. The gluteus maximus muscle lies superior to this nerve, and when you're shown techniques to be able to give an injection in the hip or in the gluteal muscle, particular landmarks are given to you so you can stay away from this nerve. You certainly don't want to puncture that nerve with a needle. The superior border of the iliac crest, you need to palpate for, palpating for the hip, the greater trochanter of the hip. If you can palpate these two areas and draw an imaginary line from this point to this one, then you stay above this line and to the right, the gluteus maximus muscle that keeps you away from the sciatic nerve, and that's a technique that you'll learn in clinical areas. There's also the lumbar plexus. The only nerve I want you to be able to identify there is the femoral nerve. The femoral nerve. And as you can see, a previous photograph illustration, femoral nerve extends down, goes through the inguinal region, and extends down anteriorly over the hip bone, and then will branch into several nerves. So the lumbar plexus, you should be able to identify the sacral plexus. From the lumbar plexus, you should be able to identify the femoral nerve. From the sacral plexus, you should be able to identify the sciatic nerve. Now I'll begin the lecture portion of the examination. For the lecture portion of the examination, you should be able to tell me the components of the central nervous system. The components of the central nervous system. You should be able to tell me the difference between somatic muscles. Somatic muscles, what's meant by the term somatic muscles? What's meant by the term visceral muscle group? Visceral muscle group. Which one is voluntary and which one is involuntary as far as nervous system innervation? You should be able to discern between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. What are the general characteristics of both of those systems? Which one innervates the somatic system? Which one innervates visceral system? Or is there overlap between the two systems? You should know what's meant by the term myelin sheath. You should know where myelin sheath is located. You should know the responsibilities of the oligodendrocytes in providing a myelin sheath. You should know the role of the Schwann cells in providing a myelin sheath. You should compare and contrast the Schwann cells and the oligodendrocytes so you know the difference between the two. You should know what's meant by the term neurolema. Neurolema, N-E-U-R-I-L-E-M-M-A. Neurolema of axons in the peripheral nervous system. What cells are responsible for forming this neurolema? You should know what glial cells are. Glial cells, G-L-I-A-L, what glial cells are. You should know what the main cells in the nervous system are called. What the main cells in the nervous system are called. You need to know the definition of a synapse. You need to know what's meant by the term retrograde flow. Retrograde flow. You need to be able to give me an example of a disease process or an infection that can infect the nervous system by retrograde flow. You need to be able to give me the definition of meninges. You should be able to tell me the three meningeal layers that surround nervous tissue in the central nervous system and the spinal cord. You should specifically be able to give me the locations of each one of those meningeal layers. You need to know which one of those layers is primarily responsible for mingling with or integrating the blood vessels. Which layer would you see the blood vessels coursing through? You need to know what's meant by the term spinal nerves. You need to be able to identify whether spinal nerves have both motor and sensory, or only motor and only sensory. You need to be able to identify what the components are, or what is meant by visceral nerves. You need to know the role of the spinal nerves in the sacral region of the body and the role of the spinal nerves in the lumbar region of the body. You need to know what artery is composed, or what artery is made up from the ventral rami of the spinal nerves of the brachial plexus, extending from C5 through T1. There's a specific nerve or a specific group of nerves, and what that, and let me completely rephrase that question because I asked that wrong. The ventral rami of the spinal nerves that extends from C5 through T1 has a specific name for a nervous system plexus, and I need the name of that plexus. Again, the ventral rami of the spinal nerves extends from the level of C5 through T1. There's a nervous system plexus, and I need the name of that nervous system plexus. I need to know what plexus the ulnar nerve would be found in, the radial nerve, and the median nerve. What plexus would that be found in? Again, you need to know what's meant by the term meningeal layers. You need to know the three meningeal layers. You need to be able to briefly describe each of those three meningeal layers. You need to know what's meant by the definition of meningitis. Meningitis. You need to know the role of cerebral spinal fluid. You need to know what cells produce cerebral spinal fluid and where they produce cerebral spinal fluid at. You do need to know what structures in the brain what structures in the head, I guess I should say, help to protect the brain. What structures help to protect the brain? You need to know where higher level functioning controlling the respiratory rhythmicity center is located at. Where's the respiratory center of the nervous system located at? Where's the visual cortex of the body located at? Where's the auditory cortex of the body located at? And again, there's another question identifying the role of the parasympathetic nervous system versus the sympathetic nervous system. You need to know the role of the vagus nerve. What are the characteristics of the vagus nerve? Does it have sympathetic, parasympathetic fibers? Does it have sensory fibers, motor fibers? The vagus nerve. You need to know what chemical substances or endocrine substances are released by the adrenal gland, especially when we talk about postganglionic neurons in the adrenal gland. What particular chemical substances are typically released, and where are they released to? You need to know what happens when you increase parasympathetic stimulation. You need to know what occurs when you increase sympathetic stimulation. You need to know what the term dual innervation refers to. Dual innervation. You need to know the role of the celiac plexus. You need to know whether sympathetic or parasympathetic fibers pass through this. The cardiac plexus. You need to know what endocrine substances are released by epinephrine. You need to know what chemical substances are produced by the adrenal medulla. And yes, one of those substances is epinephrine. What is the other one? You need to know the response of the blood pressure in response to sympathetic stimulation. You need to know the target cells for antidiuretic hormone, the target cells for oxytocin. You need to know what the primary physiologic effect is for thyroid hormone. You need to know what chemical substances are secreted by the adrenal medulla. What substances are secreted by the adrenal medulla. You need to know what substances are secreted by the kidneys. What hormone substances, I guess I should say specifically. You should be able to tell me the function and the role of erythropoietin. Function and role of erythropoietin. You should be able to tell me where glucagon is secreted from and what is the action of glucatron. Glucagon. You should also be able to tell me where calcitriol is secreted from and what the role of calcitriol is. I need to know the role, if I haven't already said this, of calcitriol, where it is secreted at, what's its function. I also need to know the role and function of renin and where renin is secreted at. I need to know the role and function of insulin. I need to know where insulin is produced at. And that pretty much covers all the material that I'm going to cover on that exam. Good luck in your studying.